Before we get into today's stories, never miss an update by signing up for the Dread Weekly newsletter on dreadsarmy.com. The link is in the description too. Get the latest encounters, trail camera footage, and news in your inbox once a week. Now, let's get to the story. I was on a solo road trip across the United States. Long story short, I had some health issues that I thought were going to turn out worse than they did. Happy to say that I'm now okay, but it put things into perspective for me. During the course of treatment, I fell in love with a national park near the treatment center and decided that if I ever got well, I would visit as many national parks as I could. And so I set out to do just that. I was driving through the desert. It was so hot you could cook an egg on the pavement. The desert is amazing at dawn and dusk, but during the daytime, it's absolutely miserable. I become nocturnal. I had been traveling and exploring at night and sleeping during the day. One particular morning, I rolled into a little, run downtown to try to find a spot at a motel. This was all before the age of internet and cell phones, so you couldn't pre-book anything unless you called ahead. I had stayed inside a park the night before, but now it was too hot to even breathe, so I was desperate for an actual room with some air conditioning. There were only 2 people in the entire motel, but to be honest, the town didn't seem all that great. It was a sort of in-between stop along the highway. Luckily, there was a state park nearby. They didn't have any campsites, but they had loads of hiking trails, so I was excited to head over there that evening. I talked to the lady at the front desk for a bit. I was telling her about my trip thus far and told her my plans to go hiking that night. She got real quiet and told me that it's best to stay indoors around here after dark, but she wouldn't say why. I spent the rest of the day lazily milling around my room until the sun started to set. I was heading to my car when I met one of the other motel guests. He asked where I was going and I told him I was going for a hike. He seemed a bit odd, so I didn't want to give out any specific details. I instantly knew I was right about him because he started going off about aliens. He said there are aliens all over the skies at night and it's not safe for anyone to be out. He said the aliens attack people and make them disappear. That's why there are so many disappearances in the desert. It's the aliens. And then he said the aliens use birds to watch us. That birds aren't really birds? It was a wild, one-sided conversation. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just told him to have a nice evening and I sprinted to my car. He begged and pleaded for me to stay indoors. I seriously think he thought I was going to die. To be completely honest, at that point I was more worried about crazy people than I was about the supposed aliens, so I left. I got to the park and there was a barricade across the parking lot. There was a sign that said closed due to wildlife encounter. I know it was stupid, but I ignored it and continued into the parking lot anyway. I was only going to do a short hike and I didn't plan on coming back here again, so I wanted to see everything I could. I picked a short trail to an overlook point. I wasn't long on the trail when I saw a shadow fly over my head. I couldn't see what it was, but it dropped low enough that I could hear the sound of feathered wings. I continued onward without incident for another mile, and then it happened again. I didn't see it that time either, but I figured whatever it was, it didn't want me around, so I started to turn back. It flew over me a third time and landed in front of me on the trail. I couldn't make out its shape in the darkness. The moon was bright enough to hike without a flashlight, but not enough for me to identify this creature. It was about the size of a golden retriever and covered in feathers. I thought maybe it was an eagle, but its tail feathers were much longer and almost neon colored. I grabbed my flashlight out of my backpack and shined it on the animal. The face staring back at me was nothing I could have ever imagined. It had a lizard's face. Its whole face was scaled. Feathers erupted from its cheeks and traveled down its entire body. It had little claws on its wings like a bat, and its hind feet looked like those of a chicken, but much larger. The bulk of its feathers were red, but it had some mixed with yellow around its face and belly. It looked like there was some blue in its tail. The creature was strikingly beautiful, but it had the eyes of a reptile. I had no idea what I was looking at. I tried to get my camera out of my backpack, but the thing took flight before I could snap a picture. I was shaking all the way back to the car. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. The other motel guests stopped me on my way back in and asked if I saw the aliens out there. Come to find out that while extremely rare, these things are out there. The locals know about them and everybody has their own theory as to what they are. The natives call them thunderbirds and say they've been around since the dawn of time. There aren't many of them left anymore and they only really come out at night. Either way, it's an experience I'll never forget. I worked as a county sheriff for a small, unremarkable town in New Hampshire. I was called to the local middle school one night at about 6:30 p.m. on a complaint that there was a group of kids on the property harassing a group of students who stayed late rehearsing a school play. The entire thing sounded a bit ridiculous, but sometimes just showing up with a squad car is enough to set unruly kids straight. I arrived at the school and didn't see any kids hanging around outside. I went in the building and found the students in the cafeteria, along with 3 teachers. The story they told me was that there were a group of 6 or 7 kids outside who all looked between 10 and 14 years old. Apparently they were dressed in very conservative type clothes and kept going from window to window and banging on the glass, asking to be let in. Every time one of the teachers would go outside to talk to them, the kids would scatter. They ended up moving the students into the cafeteria because there were no windows. The teacher said they did not recognize any of the kids outside. There wasn't much I could do about the situation until I found the kids. I didn't see any of them while driving in, but there was a little forest on the backside of the school past the softball field, where they could very well be hanging out. That's where I would hide if I was a kid up to no good. I asked the students if they recognized any of the kids, knowing full well they wouldn't rat out their friends if they did. Only one girl responded. She was probably 11 years old if I had to make a guess. She said she saw one of the kids through the window and it wasn't a kid. It looked like a kid, but it was something else. I asked her what she meant, but she couldn't explain it. She said it asked to come inside and she knew she shouldn't let it in. She said that it had black eyes. Not dark brown, not gray, but black. The entire eye was black. The pupil, the iris, the whole thing. At first, I thought she was trying to be funny, but it wasn't an act. I could see it on her face. This girl was genuinely scared. I decided to take a walk around the school grounds. I told the teachers and the students to call me right away if they saw any of the kids again and not to let them in the building, no matter what. I don't exactly know why I said that, but something about that girl's story stuck with me. I walked the entire perimeter of the school and came up with nothing. I decided to take a look in the forest and see if I could see any signs of them in there. The sun was beginning to set, but it wasn't yet dark enough for a flashlight. If I was going to take a look in the woods, I should do it now. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary, but something felt off. I couldn't quite place the feeling, but as soon as I stepped past the trees, I just knew. My phone rang not 30 seconds later. It was one of the teachers. She said the kids were back and were banging a library window. I ran back to the school hoping to be fast enough to catch these kids. I reached the library but didn't see a soul. I jumped in my car and drove around the entire outside of the school and still no kids. I went inside again to talk to the teachers and ask them exactly what they saw. The story was the same. Kids dressed up in conservative clothes, banging on the windows and doors and asking to come inside. As soon as they picked up the phone, the kids disappeared. We checked the school cameras and found absolutely nothing at all. The camera should have picked up something, but I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. I headed back to the cafeteria to where the rest of the students were. I told the teachers that I couldn't find the kids, but I suggested they cut it short tonight and send everyone home. If it happens again, we'll figure it out then. That little 11-year-old girl from before stopped me and said, "What happens if someone lets them in?" I told her I didn't know. And then she said, "I heard them banging on the doors in the library. And then I heard the door open and banging stopped. Does that mean they are in here? Did someone let them in?" The room was dead silent until one of the teachers spoke. She said she saw the kids outside of the library. There is a door from the library that leads to a courtyard. She opened it to yell at the kids, but when they saw her, they ran away. She said they kept running, so she left the library. As she was leaving, she heard the door open and close, but when she turned around, she didn't see anyone. I can't explain it, but I knew we were in trouble. I had everyone file into the nearest classroom and shut the door. I told all the kids to call their parents and have them pick them up early, and if they couldn't, I would drive them home in the squad car. I called for backup and said I needed some officers to help drive these kids home. We only waited for maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like an hour. I thought I might have overreacted, but then I heard footsteps outside in the hall. They were quiet footsteps, like those of a child. The footsteps stopped when they reached the door, and then someone knocked. "Please, let me in." "I'm lost," said the voice. It was a child's voice, but I knew better. It repeated the same line 3 times. "Let me in. I'm lost." After the 3rd time, I yelled through the door and told it that it wasn't allowed to be here and that it wasn't allowed to come in. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard footsteps walking away. I opened the door to see if I could get a glimpse of the kid, but there was nothing there. We got the rest of the students and teachers out safely to their cars. I have no idea what those things were, but I know they weren't human. The only good thing I have to say about them is it looks like you have to invite them in. And my recommendation is don't invite them in. There isn't anything good that can come of it. A few months back, I was staying the night at one of my friend's houses. He lives on the far edge of our town in Utah. He still had neighbors around, but there was a lot of forest around too, and it was next to a canyon. I don't know if the scenery helps the story, but I will try to list every detail of my encounter. I was staying the night with him, and my girlfriend also came over to hang out for a while. We hung out, and everything was fun and great. 1 a.m. rolled around, and I had work at 6 a.m. in another town about 30 minutes away. So I said I was ready for bed. At this time, my friend went to sleep, and it was just me and my girlfriend who was heading home. As we were walking to her car, I began feeling uneasy, like I could hear something. We got to the driver's side of her car, and I gave her a hug goodbye. As I'm hugging her, I look behind her, and I'm struck with shock and fear. I see a creature maybe 8 to 9 feet tall, standing next to a cherry tree on the side of my friend's driveway. It was standing on 2 legs and very skinny. The moon was out, so I could see this thing clearly, but not so much any color details. The legs were bent backwards like deer's legs or rear moose legs. It slouched a lot, and I still couldn't see its face. It was in the leaves of the cherry tree, which had to be at least 12 feet tall. I remember not being able to talk much, except goodbye to my girlfriend. I don't know why, but I couldn't even tell her to look behind her. Before I let go of her, though, I saw this thing move. It took off running, and what absolutely baffled my mind was the speed of this creature. It looked impossible, as if it were blurry when it started running. I remember it looking right at me through the leaves, even though I could not see its face. The worst thing about the experience was the emotions attached to seeing what I saw. I felt like my confidence and emotions were attacked. I have never felt the feeling of fear like this before, and I have even been charged by a full-grown brown bear. After my girlfriend got into the car, I stood in that very spot where I hugged her until she left the driveway. I don't know if it was more out of fear or making sure she left safely. I didn't know what to do, so I slowly walked over to my car and got in. I called my friend multiple times, but he was asleep and did not answer. I looked at my window after several minutes and looked to the left and saw my friend's cat, Avery. I tried to think logically. If my friend's cat, who probably has better senses than me, is out here, then I am probably seeing things and it's totally safe. So I got out and stood next to Avery. Next thing I know, I hear the sound like there's a Clydesdale horse running through the forest. Avery started running for the door, and I sprinted faster than her and we both got inside. For the next 3 hours, I sat there on full alert. The fear I felt was indescribably powerful, and I kept remembering additional things about the experience. I remembered it had long arms, and when it ran, it used all its limbs. Please, somebody tell me if this is a real creature. It gives me goosebumps to this day talking about it. And writing this just brought it all back to me, and I had been doing better. I just can't stop thinking about how scary this was. Let me know what you know. Thanks. I've never written into a show before, but the experience I had is keeping me up at night. I'm hoping if you read it, someone will say something in the comments, like they've heard of this or maybe even seen one themselves. I live near Franconia Notch, New Hampshire. I'd prefer not to say the actual town name, but it's a pretty small town Christian community. I'm afraid of what my neighbors would say if I told them I saw this thing on my property. We have black bears here and they're always getting your trash cans. I've even seen a young black bear robbing birdseed from my bird feeder. So when I kept finding my cans overturned, I felt pretty strongly that bears were the culprit. I don't believe in shooting animals. I don't own a gun. When I see bears near the house, it's usually enough to go out with a couple of frying pans and clang them together. Unless you get between a mother and cubs, bears around here at least are pretty easy to scare off. Where I live is pretty far from any real city and there's not much reflected light. It gets really dark, but the upside is you can see a lot of stars. Since I was having trouble with my trash cans, I installed some of those motion sensor lights on the back of my house. A few weeks ago, I was settled in front of the TV in my living room, watching the 11 o'clock news, when the motion sensor lights came on and I heard a trash can get knocked over. So I scrambled up and ran into the kitchen to grab a couple of saucepans, then rushed out the back door to catch the bears in the act. I figured if I could do this a few times, make a lot of noise right when they were scrounging the cans, they'd associate the unpleasant sound with the act and maybe find someone else to bother. But when I got out on my back porch, I didn't see any bears. The lights were blazing and I scanned the yard, but all I saw was the overturned trash can. There were bags on the ground that had spilled out, but nothing had been torn open. I figured when the lights came on, the bear took off. At least, that's what I thought at the time. I wasn't wearing shoes, but I knew I better toss the bags back in and secure the lid, or the raccoons would come by and make a mess. I stepped back into the kitchen and put on my wellies, then tromped out to the yard. I bent down to pick up one of the bags, but then I noticed the black plastic had beads of moisture on it. It hadn't rained for a few days, and I was pretty sure the inside of the can was dry. I was about to pick it up anyway, but I was kind of grossed out, wondering if the animal, bear, or raccoon had urinated on it. I sniffed the air but didn't smell anything. I decided to play it safe and walked around to the side porch where I keep a pair of latex gloves. I was rummaging through the shelves on the porch looking for the gloves when the backyard light timed out since I wasn't in the yard. It was annoying since now I had no illumination to help me find the gloves, but I found them a few minutes later without having to go back inside and get a flashlight. I stepped back onto the grass and headed through the side yard to the back where the trash cans were. When I got to the corner of the house, the motion detector kicked in and the floodlights came back on. What I saw stopped me in my tracks, my blood running cold. It defied explanation. There was a creature like nothing I've ever seen before, crouched over the trash bags. It had almost a human form, except it was really gaunt and the head was elongated. It was completely naked and hairless. Even its head and its skin was kind of a weird pale color. It was crouched on all fours like an animal. I didn't know what I was seeing. My mind just couldn't process it. I gasped and the thing looked up. Its face was absolutely terrifying. Big, black, oval-shaped eyes, no nose at all. Its mouth was just this open black pit. I think it saw me watching it because it suddenly made this weird clicking sound. I stumbled back, too afraid to even run, and the thing scooted away, super fast. It was like a blur, it was so fast. On all fours the whole time. The yard lights were still on, and I could see it now, crouched on the side of the garage. When I say crouched on the side of the garage, I mean literally it was defying gravity, crouched on all fours, somehow clinging to the side wall of my garage. My eyes were glued to it. I was too afraid to turn my back on it. I was so scared. I felt like I was going to pass out. It skittered away and suddenly it was on the roof of the garage. The way it moved was almost the most frightening aspect. It was there and then it was somewhere else. Then the yard lights went out because I had stayed motionless for a few minutes and the thing was out of range. So for a split second, I'm in the absolute darkness with this creature. I almost peed my pants. I took 2 tiny steps forward, and the lights came back on, thank God. I looked at the roof, but it was gone. It was several more minutes before I was brave enough to move toward the backyard, but I knew if I didn't move, the lights would go out again. I'd come out the back door, and that was the only door that was unlocked. I didn't see it again. I got back inside the house and locked the doors and windows. I left the garbage can overturned on the grass and the bags right where they lay. Raccoons and bears were the least of my worries. I haven't got a decent night's sleep since that happened. Well, that's my story. I'd be curious to know if anyone else has ever seen this creature, and if they have any more information about it. I hope it never comes back. I can't even make myself go outside at night anymore. For most of my life, I honestly found the idea of the paranormal to be kind of ridiculous. That being said, sometimes things happen that are truly nuts and truly unexplainable. This is what happened to me. When I was fresh out of college, I got this really good job in Baltimore. Maryland is a really nice place, and to this day, I think the city's reputation is unnecessarily bad. The job I landed was at a marketing firm, which meant my salary was good enough for me to be able to move into an apartment on my own. But my savings meant I could only afford the worst apartments the city had to offer. I say the worst with a grain of salt, because the area I got the place in wasn't half bad. It was just really dingy and really small and also ridiculously old. The elevator was there purely for decorative purposes, and my landlord did not care about my half-broken appliances. Still though, the place was my own, and that was something I was proud of. I had a few friends in the city too, so I wasn't too lonely. All in all, everything was initially going exactly the way I had planned. Then, of course, the weird stuff began. A few weeks into living there, I realized that my heating and air conditioning was totally busted. Not just half busted, the apartment was freezing cold constantly, even though it was the middle of summer. This totally irritated me, mainly because I hate the cold. But what really got me was that my landlord insisted everything was completely up to date, and told me that there's nothing wrong with it. The next issue, the much bigger issue, was that a lot of my valuable stuff started going missing. Some books of mine, even the one that I was currently reading, the one I knew was sitting on my bed, disappeared into thin air. Then came other things. Mail and even my keys at one point went missing for a few days and then turned up in the most random parts of the house, which made me think I was just losing it. This continued for a while, and I tried my best to ignore it until I didn't have that option anymore. That feeling of being out of options came when I was woken up one night. Right in the middle of the night, I want to say around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sounds of giggling in my room. I was only half convinced I was hearing this because I thought maybe it could have been a part of my dream that continued a bit into my waking up. But then I saw some of the creepiest stuff I've ever seen in my life. I turned looking towards the door that went into the hallway, and I see a small shadowy figure staring back at me. I didn't have sleep paralysis or anything. I could move, but knowing that I was really seeing this and there wasn't anything physically wrong with me almost made it scarier. The figure didn't have much of a hard outline and didn't move or anything. It sort of just stood there looking at me with these glowing eyes. I reached over to grab my phone to call someone for help and to not feel alone. But when I turned back towards the door, the shadow was gone. I naturally laid awake for the rest of the night. The next day, I did something I wasn't proud of. I found a psychic online. There are surprisingly a lot more out there than you'd think. My first thought was, that can't be a lucrative business, but then I realized that if I'm calling them, then other people probably are too. Truth was, I was starting to get extra freaked out. Even though I didn't see the figure again, waking up in the middle of the night became an unfortunate routine of mine. My stuff continued to go missing. My apartment was still freezing, and I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder in my own home. After I accepted this descent into madness, I paid the psychic lady a couple $100 to come and cleanse my apartment. The experience was definitely odd, but something I'll say is that a psychic is nothing if not charismatically persuasive. This lady had me convinced my place was haunted, and even though I was only half buying it, I knew this was my last option and that I was better off safe than sorry. The thing that really sold me was that when she said she sensed a presence, I asked her what kind. She responded that whatever it was innocent, and that if it was a ghost, it was likely a child. That kind of made everything click for me, you know, because based on the shadow I saw, which was certainly kid-sized, mixed with the random giggling and the specific objects that kept going missing, it all sort of added up. So as much as a situation like this could make any sense, it surprisingly did. I honestly couldn't tell you exactly what this lady did, but whatever it was, it worked. She burned some stuff, said some things, and that's honestly all she wrote. Not only was everything now back to normal, but since then I haven't had anything similar happen to me again. And I'm thankful for that. I'm still not sure if I believe in psychics or even the paranormal, but at the end of the day, whatever she did seemed to work. And let's just say that I was especially thankful for the peace of mind.